Welcome, folks, to the Kiwanis Club of Memphis Wednesday meeting. Today is Veterans Day, which I did a little bit of looking, and I guess it originally was Armistice Day, and it changed in '54 to Veterans Day. And the other little piece of trivia that came up that I thought was interesting was the armistice was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So that's where we get November 11th from. So on that note, Armistice Day, now Veterans Day, is in memory of people who are, or in honor of people who are serving, whereas Memorial Day is in honor of people who have served or died in our wars. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, who is Mike Ellicott. He's 26 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, 16 years in higher education facility construction. And he retired from Texas Tech. And in retirement, he has become a buff of many historical facts. He leads tours to Gettysburg, am I right? And
right.
tours overseas to Normandy. And today he's going to take us on a virtual tour of the veterans and the women of World War II. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for introducing Veterans Day. And so that saves me 5 minutes. Today,
I was hoping I wasn't taking somebody's stuff, but sorry.
No, that's okay. Today is actually the 101st Armistice or Veterans Day. And so let me share my screen. Hopefully I can do that. And you should all see that screen now. Oops, I think I shared the wrong one. Hang on. How about that one? A cover slide? There we go. That looks like the right one. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me back. And again, happy Veterans Day to all the veterans and all the families of veterans that are joining us today. And today I'm going to talk about a special group of veterans, women veterans of World War II, both in and out of uniform. And some you'll have heard of, and some are unsung heroes. By the way, the talk I'm giving today is based on one I gave my granddaughter's 5th grade Girls Empowerment Club. And I found that audience far more intimidating than the one today. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. And I heard you'd like to have a vigorous question and answer session. And so hopefully some of the people and the events I talk about will spark an interest we can explore later. As probably most of you know, prior to World War II, not many women worked outside the home. And those that did were teachers, nurses, librarians, and secretaries. And as you'll see, all those are useful skills in a war, but the women in World War II accomplished far more. 350,000 of them joined the military. They joined the Army and became WWII, Women Army Corps. The Navy, the women accepted for volunteer emergency services, WAVES. They joined the Coast Guard, and they were called SPARs. And they also joined the Marines. And in that kind of unusual place, women took a small but not insignificant step forward for equality. When the Commandant of the Marine Corps was asked what he would call women Marines, he said, well, they're Marines. God bless the Marine Corps. In addition to joining the military, 6 million of them joined the workforce. And they not only built tanks and airplanes, ships and guns, they also joined the traditional workforce, working in dairies and foundries, canneries and fish plants, and made a significant contribution to the war. But before we get into all that, let's start at the beginning. And for America, it started on December 7th, 1941, with the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and their use of unprecedented, unexpected use of a new technology. So looking at the crowd, probably a lot of you remember the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. And in that film, as the Japanese attacking planes approach Pearl Harbor, they engulf a yellow biplane with a woman instructor pilot and a student. And that is not a figment of Hollywood imagination. It actually happened. But Hollywood got one thing wrong. The woman instructor pilot was not the matronly woman portrayed in the film. was actually this young lady, a 22-year-old debutante from Nashville, Cornelia Fort. And so having come up close and personal with the attack, she decided that she wanted to get more involved in the war effort. And so after a time when it was sort of, everybody thought it was safe to travel again, she returned to the United States. And she donned a uniform. She didn't don the uniform of the Army, Navy, Marines, or Coast Guard because they wouldn't let women fly. But what she did do is don this uniform as a WASP, a Women Air Force Service Pilot. They were basically civilian government contractors taking the place of male pilots, doing training missions, logistical supply missions, and ferrying new airplanes from the factory to the bases in the United States. 25,000 women applied for the job. 1,800 were selected. 1,074 eventually graduated and joined the WASPs. 38 of them were killed in the line of duty. And unfortunately, Cornelia Fort was the first. The day after Pearl Harbor, on December 8th, FDR gave his famous Day of Infamy speech and asked that Congress declare war on Japan. All members of Congress, except one, voted to declare war. Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin, a Democrat from Montana, a lifelong suffragette and pacifist, voted against the war, saying, "I can't go to war and I refuse to send anyone else." That clearly ended her political career, but many commented on the strength of her conviction. Interestingly enough, she was also voted against going to war in World War I in 1917. Here's another very interesting woman member of Congress, Edith Norse Rogers, a Republican from Massachusetts. She is involved in three very important pieces of legislation. In 1942, she authored the bill to create the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and in 1943, the bill to create the Women's Army Corps, where women were formally integrated into the Army. Later on, she was actively involved in creating the GI Bill. And you can see in the left-hand picture, she's standing behind FDR as he signs the Serviceman's Readjustment Act of 1944, a phenomenally successful piece of legislation that significantly altered post-World War II America. And it was a world war. All the blue countries there are our allies, the three primary, FDR, the United States, Winston Churchill's Britain, and Premier Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. If not a friend, certainly an ally. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, I guess. And we were fighting the Axis powers, Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Tojo's Japan. There was one strong woman leader in this bunch, and that was Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. She and her government, along with a lot of their gold, escaped the country when the Nazis invaded in May 1940, set up a government in exile in London, and throughout the war gave inspiring, fiery speeches to her countrymen, inspiring them to resist the German occupation. One of the young ladies listening to her speeches was Audrey Kathleen Rustin, who was trapped in the city of Arnhem during the war. You probably know her better as Audrey Hepburn. And there is significant information to lead she was active in the Dutch resistance, although she never admitted it. The United States divided the war into two parts, two theaters of war. In the European theater, the road to success led to Berlin, and the key was to defeat the German army. And that meant it was primarily a land war. And we started that actually 78 years ago last Sunday with the invasion of North Africa, followed by the July 1943 invasion of Sicily, and September 43 invasion of Italy. But the crowning event of the European theater occurred on June 6, 1944, with a cross-channel attack into Normandy, 156,000 Allied soldiers landing in 24 hours. What's often lost in all that is that the Soviets, a few days later, launched their own massive attack from the east, all of them driving on to Berlin. One of the first things that happened on D-Day was 3 glider loads of British paratroopers landed and seized this bridge over the Caen Canal on the left flank of the Allied invasion zone. After seizing the bridge, accomplishing their mission, being paratroopers, they liberated the Café Gondré and its bar. Now, the Gondré family was thrilled to see the British liberators, went out in the backyard, dug up the bottles of good champagne they had buried there when the Germans invaded in 1940. And the Gondrés and their 3 daughters, including this young lady here, Arlette, who was 6 years old at the time, served the champagne to the British soldiers. Arlette still runs the Café Gondré today and served us lunch when we were there for the 75th anniversary in 2019. A very charming woman, as long as she doesn't think you're German. She will not serve you. You've probably heard the expression, an army marches on its stomach, and that's true. And the government had that covered, I guess, as long as you like your food out of green cans. Another thing that's important to soldiers in mail, and there the government had a problem. Ultimately sending over 2 million Americans to England before D-Day, they had not made significant progress on getting rid of the backlog of mail, and there were several warehouses full of mail bags like this. So to solve the problem, they created a special unit, the 68th 88th Postal Directory Battalion, composed of 855 African-American women, all in uniform, commanded by Major Charity Adams, and she is in the far left of the bottom photograph there. If you've been to the National Civil Rights Museum in downtown Memphis, you've seen this photo. They have a little exhibit on this unit. And within about 3 months, they eliminated the backlog of mail in England. And no small task, just think of how many letters there were that were addressed to Private John Smith, U.S. Army, England. And trying to figure out which John Smith got what letter was a daunting task. They followed the army to France and performed similar miracles. Unfortunately, in July of 1945, 3 women, members of this unit, were killed in a Jeep accident. They are all buried in the Normandy American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. One of the reasons why the United States was so receptive to having women in the military was the success of the British women in their military. And shown here is a British mechanic working on her vehicle in 1942. She may look a little bit familiar to you, so let me help you out. Here's a family photo with Mom, Dad, and Sister Margaret, taken on the balcony of Buckingham Palace on Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. That's, of course, Queen Elizabeth II, 67 plus years as Queen, the longest living monarch, 4th place on the all-time list. The longest serving monarch, it turned out, I was surprised to learn, was Louis XIV of France, who had 72 plus years, but he did start when he was 5. In the Pacific War, Pacific Theater, the road to success led to Tokyo. And as you can see, this is primarily an ocean area. It's a naval war. And the key task here was to defeat the Japanese fleet. The war, as we pointed out, started out on December 7th in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese also invaded the Philippines that day, ultimately conquering the Philippines, capturing a number of Americans, including 77 Army nurses. Miraculously, all 77 of those nurses survived 3.5 years in captivity, and while they continued to provide exceptional medical care under very difficult conditions. 59,000 women, nurses, participated in World War II. 16 of them were killed in action. 565 received combat decorations. The first to do so was First Lieutenant Annie Fox, who got first the Purple Heart, and then it was converted to a Bronze Star for her actions in Wickham and Wickham Field on the 7th of December. The road to Tokyo took 2 paths. In the Southwest Pacific, Army General of the Army Douglas MacArthur went through New Guinea and the Philippines. In the Central Pacific, Navy Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz led the famous island hopping campaign. They were all headed for a November 1945 invasion of the southern Japanese home island of Kyushu, followed by a March 1946 invasion of the main Japanese island of Hokkaido. Fortunately, that was not necessary. On August 6, 1945, America dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, followed by another one on August 9th on Nagasaki. decisions that remain, maybe even are more controversial today than they were at the time. It was dropped from this plane, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay. It was the Enola Gay's pilot's mother's name, and that's Colonel Paul Tibbets. In addition to being the pilot of that plane, for the previous year and a half, he had run the Air Force's program to develop the B-29 to be the premier bomber in the Pacific. And that was not without a few challenges. Among one, that the engines had this disturbing habit of catching fire. And that made it to the point where many of the male pilots thought it was too dangerous to fly and wouldn't fly. And so that's why we're talking about the plane in the midst of a talk on women in World War II. Colonel Tibbets decided the way to solve this problem was to fly a plane to the WASP training base in Sweetwater, Texas. He trained those two ladies in the picture, Dorothea Johnson and Dora Doherty, how to fly the plane, named it the Lady Bird, and then flew to various air bases in the United States and basically said to the male pilots, well, guys, these two ladies can fly the plane. What's your problem? And that, along with significant improvements in the airplane, led to the success of the B-29 and the Japanese surrender on VJ, Victory in Japan Day, September 2nd, 1945. And this is General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur, signing the Japanese surrender documents on board the Missouri, USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. So a couple of things contributed to the Allied success. And one was the strategy that FDR, President Roosevelt, outlined in his fireside speech in 1940. And that was he would make America the arsenal of democracy. Not only would we outfight our enemies, we would outbuild them. And I think the 6 million women that entered the workforce made that possible. And so probably the folks in Michigan will recognize this picture. This is the Willow Run B-24 bomber plant, built and managed by Ford Motor Company. It's a mile-long assembly line of B-24s, and at peak production, they were cranking a 4-engine bomber out every 63 minutes. It's also the home of Rose Will Monroe, who generally is agreed to be the namesake of Rosie the Riveter. Unfortunately, Rose Will didn't get a whole lot of publicity, and she's not either one of the two women shown on these two posters. In the lower left corner, that's Norman Rockwell's magazine cover of Rosie the Riveter, and that lady is Mary Doyle Keefe, and she was a telephone operator in Norman Rockwell's hometown. The other one, the famous We Can Do It, Rosie with the red and white polka dot bandana, fair amount of current controversy. It's either Geraldine Hoff Doyle, who also worked in a machine shop in Lansing, Michigan, or more likely Naomi Parker Fraley in the upper photo with the bandana on her head. And she worked in a machine shop in an aircraft factory in San Diego. But in any event, all of the women made significant contributions to the war. Here's a couple of other interesting Rosies. The woman on the left is an 80-year-old riveter who worked reliably, according to the plant manager, on the 7:45 to 4:45 shift, building B-29 bombers in Marietta, Georgia. Her name is Helen Dortch Longstreet. And if that name rings a bell with some of you, she is the widow of Civil War General James Longstreet, who clearly had married her late in his life. The other young woman working on a drone is Norma Jean Dougherty. And the Army sent a newsreel team to the factory to take pictures of the women working in the factory. When they saw the pictures of Norma Jean, they said, oh, there's a winner, and sent the team back to get more pictures. Norma Jean, being an enterprising young woman, took some of those pictures to a Hollywood talent scout, dyed her hair blonde, and became Marilyn Monroe. Here's another little trivia fact. The commander of that Army newsreel team, Captain Ronald Reagan. Rosie the Riveter had some sisters, Wendy the Welder, and this is Mary Carroll, and she, along with her friends Jean Wild and Louise Cox, became the first 3 women welders at the Kaiser Richmond, California shipyard. And in order to become welders, they had to join the all-male Boilermakers Union in 1942, which I'm thinking was not probably a whole lot of fun for any of them. In any event, the Kaiser shipyard. Henry Kaiser figured out how to mass produce ships. This is mainly Liberty ships, 440-foot long Liberty ships and escort carriers. And the ship in that photo was completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Another thing that women contributed to, and another reason why Americans were able to win World War II, is we had broken both the German and the Japanese codes. Much of the breaking of German codes occurred in Bletchley Park. It's a small estate, about 60 miles northwest of London. On the bottom right-hand corner is the German Enigma machine, a very sinister little cipher machine. And on the left is the bomb, the machine invented by Alan Turing and perfected by Gordon Welchman. If you saw the picture of the movie The Imitation Game, pretty accurate, except Gordon Welchman got left out. It's not a computer, it's a high-speed electromechanical calculator used in solving, in breaking the codes. Just a fascinating story, but that's a whole nother lecture on how they did that. Most of the 10,000, most of the 12,000 or so women, most of the 12,000 people who worked at Bletchley Park were young women, primarily working in administrative jobs. The young lady in the center there is Ruth Bourne. She was 97 in 2017 when that picture was taken, and she was a bomb operator. She operated the machine to break the code. She was sworn to secrecy, never talked about what she did for 30 years, and never really knew what she was doing until one of the higher ups at Bletchley Park published a book in 1970. I asked her if it was exciting. She said, no, it was boring and noisy. Here's another young woman who worked at Bletchley Park. This is Valerie Glassborough, who worked there along with her twin sister, Mary. And both Valerie and Mary have bricks on the Wall of Honor at Bletchley Park. If you look carefully, you can see that there were twin sisters, and they married the Middleton brothers. And so some of you may have figured out where I'm going with this. Okay, there is Valerie's granddaughter looking at her grandmother's brick on the wall. That is, of course, Kate, the Duchess of Cambridge. American had their own code girls. The Army and the Navy brought about 10,000 young women to Washington, D.C. to help break codes, primarily the Japanese codes. The Navy recruited their code breakers from elite East Coast university, science, math, astronomy majors. The Army recruited its code breakers from math and science teachers and librarians because they had the record-keeping skills needed for code breaking from Southern and Midwestern towns. As I said, 10,000 of them brought into Washington, D.C. to break the code. A couple of them stayed with it. The young woman on the right in this photograph grew up to be Anna Cara Christie, who retired as the deputy director of the National Security Agency, America's premier code and code-breaking organization. Much of what they did was to break the Japanese diplomatic and operational codes. The diplomatic code was the purple code, so-called purple code, because they carry the messages around in purple folders for security reasons. The Americans, too, had to build a machine, a replica of the purple machine, to break the code. But first, they had to understand how the code worked. How the code worked. And this young lady, Genevieve Grosjean, a math major from the University of Buffalo, worked on the code, and in 1940, the end of 1940, noticed a cyclical pattern in the code which allowed it to be broken and allowed the construction of the code-breaking machine. The American code girls were also sworn to secrecy, and many of them never talked about it. In fact, a couple of years ago, when a Washington Post reporter, Lisa Monday, wrote a book called The Code Girls, she still had difficulty getting people to talk about it. Genevieve, by the way, never told anyone outside the code-breaking organization exactly what that cyclical pattern was. She said, well, code breaking is code breaking, and it might be useful for us to know that someday. Here's another interesting World War II veteran. She was a code breaker, but a pioneer in using the computer to break codes. This is Grace Hopper. She developed a computer subroutine, the computer compiler, the device that translates from human language to machine language, and the computer common oriented business language, or COBOL language, that some of you with hair my color may remember learning. She also developed, originated the famous term of debugging a computer, because in 1945, when the computer you see in this picture was malfunctioning, she opened up one of the cases and found a large moth. And when removing it, it worked just fine. When she retired at the age of 79 as a Rear Admiral in the US Navy, she was the oldest serving officer of any service. So here is another interesting World War II woman, Hedwig Kiesler. She was an Austrian Jewish cabaret star, married to, in an abusive marriage, to an Austrian munitions manufacturer who was dealing with both Hitler and Mussolini. She escaped the marriage and Austria, first to London and then to Hollywood, where she became a star, better known as Hedy Lamarr. One of her more significant contributions that she tried to make to World War II was she and a piano-playing friend developed a frequency hopping communication system she hoped the Navy would use for radio-guided torpedoes. The Navy did not accept the idea, but it stayed around, and eventually the telecommunications industry adopted that, unfortunately after the patent had expired, and it's in a device we all use today. So World War II, the place in history provided 6 million women went to work and really fueled the arsenal of democracy, comprising about 37% of America's workforce at one point. 10,000 broke codes, 310,000 built airplanes, more and more built ships, tanks, everything like that. One of the more subtle effects, I think, of World War II is it created a lasting peace in Europe. We haven't had a war in Europe for 75 years. Those of you that are familiar with European history prior to World War II will remember that those guys, the British, the French, the Russians, the Germans, in some form or another, went at it about every 25 or 30 years. So the fact that we've had 75 years of peace is certainly a record. It also established the US as a superpower. It came at a significant cost, however. 411,000 Americans were killed in World War II. This is a small part of the 9,388 graves in the Normandy American Cemetery in France overlooking Omaha Beach. There are 307 unknown soldiers, and there are 4 women buried there. And this is the grave of one of them, Private Mary J. Barlow of the 88th Postal Directory Battalion, one of the 3 who were killed in that Jeep accident in 1945. And before we leave veterans, there are 2 other special World War II veterans I'd like to talk about, and that is former Marine Herschel Woody Williams of West Virginia and former Army Sergeant Charles Coolidge, who lives in East Tennessee. They are the only 2 of the 473 winners of the Medal of Honor in World War II. And there is a motion afoot to give the last of these heroes a state funeral, similar to the one that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg just got, similar to the one that America's Unknown Soldier got in 1921, as a way of celebrating all 16 million World War II veterans. There's a website there, World War II Salute, that's numeral 2, if you would like to help push that effort along. And so I'll shut up now and see if any of you, oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. Putting this together, I thought there are a few good books I could recommend. The top 2, The Code Girls, about code breakers, Lisa Monday. The Only Woman in the Room, that's about Hedy Lamarr, and she was, in fact, in Austria, often the only woman in the room. And then the bottom 3 are good accounts of the 3 major events in America's World War II, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, and the dropping of the atomic bomb. And Mary Claire has a reading list that she can share with you if you'd like it. And my wife and I this weekend found this thing on Amazon Prime, Top Secret Rosies. And the military recruited a bunch of women math wizards to be human computers, made the kind of numerical calculations that we now use computers for. And it's a fascinating story of those young ladies. So now I really will shut up and let you ask questions. Thanks for paying attention, and thanks for inviting me here.
Mike,
Yes,
this is Doug. I don't know. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
I would just like to add to what has been an excellent production here. I've really enjoyed it. I'm on the Historical Commission and Tennessee Historical Commission. And our last regular meeting prior to COVID was a year ago, October, in Oak Ridge. And I highly suggest that if you ever have a chance, that you take advantage of going up to Oak Ridge. It is still a center of the center of nuclear activity here today. They're making a number of changes. It is tight to get tours, but they hired a lot of young girls fresh out of high school to operate machinery. They really did not know what they were doing.
Yep.
It was very top secret, and I just thought I would add that if you ever get a chance to go to Oak Ridge, it's very much, I think, something I'd suggest you doing.
Yep. Yeah, Oak Ridge was primarily uranium enrichment, and there was a similar drive to hire young women to work in Hanford, Washington, where they produce plutonium. I think young women, particularly young women, were intimately involved in all of the facets of the arsenal of democracy and working to win World War II.
Right. Well, of course, it was such a tightly kept secret. And even today, it really takes an effort to get on the base, and you've got to get all sorts of clearances. So it's still very active.
Okay. Yeah, that one book I recommended, Countdown 1945. That is the story of Harry Truman's first 116 days in office. And he learned about the Manhattan Project, although in no specifics, on April 12th when Roosevelt died. But it's the story of how he was told about the Manhattan Project and the decisions he had to make. A fascinating little book.
Well, thanks again, Mike. Excellent.
Sure.
Thank you, Mike. Mary Claire, do you have something you want to share? How do we want to share those photos? Are you there? All right, I'll take some questions while we're waiting. Let's see. Oh, there she goes.
Okay. Yeah, we're gonna say we need to unshare. I need to unshare first. Sorry.
And John, are you there? Do you want to tell us a little about all this? This is wonderful archive material.
Oh, I just sent this to you guys for fun. I didn't realize.
Oh, please, please.
Part of the show. Yeah, I think leading into the war, my grandfather was already in the Army, and my grandmother had a pretty good time with her friends traveling the earth and went down to Miami and worked for some military contractors as a secretary, but at some point wanted to be closer to her husband and thought it was a good idea that she joined the Army. Since he was in the Army, she became a WAC, and it was an ill-advised decision. They still never were anywhere near each other at any point during the war, but she served, I think, a little more than a year, and I believe she wound up being a nurse and giving shots to soldiers as they were leaving the country. But she was stationed everywhere from Georgia to maybe Kentucky, and I think out in San Antonio, Texas, while she was in.
Yeah, I saw a picture of El Paso, Texas go by, and I have to tell you, the view hasn't changed much since that picture was taken.
Thank you, John. Those are beautiful photos. All right, folks, if you've got questions, we'll start taking them. You can either go to the chat or you can physically raise your hand and tell me you want to speak, and we'll recognize you. And thank you, Mike. This was a wonderful presentation. All right, Mike, I'll ask you a trivia question. When did women actually get to start serving in the armed services in combat? When did that, because I know these were all non-combat positions. So when did that transition?
There's probably out there somebody who knows exactly, but I think the combat exclusion started to be lifted in the late 80s.
Uh-huh.
And then I think 1995 or 6, somewhere in there. If anybody knows for sure or has got Google, go ahead and look that up. I just saw a very interesting presentation by a former Army attack helicopter pilot who was one of the first women to be allowed to fly an attack helicopter into combat. And so she must have been, that must have been the late 1990s or early 2000s, somewhere in there.
Thank you.
I've lulled you into a sense of
No,
I think.
I've literally never heard this group so quiet.
that's right. No, we're just so enthralled with this. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Mike,
Yeah.
I understand that when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, wasn't the Prime Minister of Japan actually in Washington meeting with our president at the time? Do you know anything about that?
Yes, no, it wasn't the prime minister. It was a special envoy from the prime minister who had been sent there at the prime minister's request to try to negotiate a peaceful end to the situation. No, the prime minister was in Japan. And there is, as far as I've ever read, there is no evidence that FDR or anyone else in the government knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked and let it happen. The government knew from, we had been breaking the Japanese code since 1940 or so. And so we knew something was going on. The general assumption was the Philippines would be attacked. I think the best example I can give is the Japanese took an aircraft carrier, which had never been a particularly offensive weapon before, as more a scouting kind of thing, put 6 of them together in a fleet, made it an assault weapon, and came out of the north where no one was looking, unfortunately, and attacked Pearl Harbor. And it's kind of like right before 9/11, if you remember, the intelligence community all knew something was going to happen. Nobody knew what, and nobody had ever used an airliner as a weapon before. So I think if you can sort of appreciate the confusion around that, that was kind of the same situation prior to Pearl Harbor.
Thank you.
Bill's waving a hand, I think.
Oh, okay, Bill.
Mike, there's a book that was written in 2013 that tells the story of the Oak Ridge connection that Doug was talking about, called The Girls of Atomic City.
Right.
Have you read that?
No, I have not. I have seen the author online talk about it, meet the author kind of thing. It looks fascinating. And I think any of those kinds of stories, the equivalent to like Code Girls and things like that, would be fascinating to learn about.
I would highly recommend your getting a copy and reading.
Okay.
All right, Doug?
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I want to just add a little bit to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I believe the Japanese minister was Sakura, and
Yes, correct.
he was given a telegraph message, heavily encrypted, and with directions that it was to be opened at such a time. But bottom line, they were very concerned, the Japanese, that the United States be informed immediately prior to the attack, so they could not be accused of attacking a nation with whom they were not at war. And my understanding is because it was on Sunday, many offices were closed. They certainly don't have the working at home capabilities we do now, that the encryption, very, very tedious, took longer than expected. And he was surprised when he delivered the message to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, a Tennessean, informing him that they were breaking off negotiations and that Japan was at war with the United States. He was informed, I think, by Hull, that actually the attack had already occurred. Therefore, Japanese honor not to attack an unprepared victim or combatant was not achieved. And my understanding is Socorro, who was a man of great honor and integrity, was mortified that they had attacked a nation with whom they were not at war. That's my understanding.
Yeah, what I have heard happened is it was a 14-part message, and they had sent the first 13 parts, and the last part was the one that said we're breaking off and declaring war.
Yeah.
And they told the Japanese ambassador that only he and Socorro could decode it and type it up, not to use anyone else. And you can probably imagine they probably weren't the quickest code breakers or typists in the world. And so that was part of the problem. And he was, maybe an hour and a half late getting to see Cordell Hull, which by that time he already knew Pearl Harbor had been bombed.
Yeah, I think that's correct. But my understanding, he was very, very mortified that the attack had already occurred.
Thank you, Doug.
You're welcome.
Does anyone else have a question for Mike? Well, Mike, thank you. This was incredibly informative, and I really enjoyed it and learned a lot.
I had a question.
Oh, Mary Claire has a question. Okay.
So, Mike, I know that the female pilots, they shuttled within the U.S. Did they eventually shuttle to England and then between England and the continent?
I think some of them might have flown like to Iceland or Greenland. I don't know of any that flew to England, and I know none flew to the continent. Toward the end of the war, they might have gone partly across the Atlantic. Looks like Doug knows the answer to that.
Yep, Doug's got.
No, I just wanted to add something. I wish I did know that, but one of the TV cable channels this morning had some broadcasting from Kansas City and the World War I Memorial.
Oh yeah.
And I just say that it doesn't receive the publicity it deserves. It is absolutely an experience worth going to Kansas City for. Right? So if you ever have a chance, by all means, go see the World War I Memorial. It's a first-rate job, and you begin to grasp some idea of just how horrible that war was. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Doug.
Did any women die at Pearl Harbor?
No women died at Pearl Harbor. There were, as I said, that one Annie Fox got the Purple Heart, which at that time was kind of a general purpose. It wasn't reserved only for the wounded veterans until 1942 or so. There were 4 other nurses who all got combat awards that day. There might have been 1 or 2 wounded, but none were killed. Miraculously, considering all that was going on.
Oh my gosh, you mean the Hollywood movie about Pearl Harbor got a fact wrong? I'm shocked.
Well, on that note, we will close our meeting, and next week we get to hear from Kevin Kane with the Memphis Tourism, hospitality in Memphis post-COVID, and then the following week will be Thanksgiving, which we will probably all celebrate in our own homes with our quarantine, whomever we are. Thank you for the folks from Lansing that came to visit, and thank you, Bartlett, for inviting them, and thank you, Mike, for a wonderful presentation. And on that note, we will end our meeting.